So as we said, no cool party starts on time, but every cool party does start. So we're about to get rolling here. So I want to talk to you for a second about what's happening this week, okay? This week, and I said this in the earlier sessions, the people that are responsible for building out the American South as the third largest economy on the planet are in the same halls together here. So that's a really, really powerful convergence. The network and the people here last year developed $200 billion of new capital investment that will create 250,000 new jobs in the American South. I mean, this is a transformative group of people. I like to say we're the third largest economy on the planet because guess what? We are. Our states came up with 10 trillion of the US GDP last year. That's the third largest economy in the planet, and fourth isn't even close to us. So these are the people that are in the conference today. Now, what's special is the future of economic development in the world's premier investment location are the YPs of SCDC and the YPs of our economic development ecosystem. And here we are, okay? So now our challenge from here is to perpetuate that and accelerate that and create stronger communities, families, states, and the entire region. We're so honored to work with you. So thank you so much for being part of the YPCon. This is the first time we've done this. I think we feel really good about it. I think you can expect some standalone programming that's maybe not adjacent to some major conferences, but we can't wait to have some fun with you today, and I'm happy to turn it over to our committee chair, Mr. Tyler Chaffee.
Perfect. Well, welcome to the YP conference, just a small part of the overall conference. I want to thank you guys for showing up. We realize it's Sunday at 2 o'clock, so that means you had to take time away from your friends and family this weekend to be here, so thank you for that. We want to make a good use of your time, and the best way we know how to do that is to encourage audience participation. So the best way we know how to do that is the open bar in the back, so feel free to grab a drink if you want one or if you need one. No judgment, but again, seriously, we want to make this a good use of your time. So if you have any questions, feel free to shout them out. We've got a good panel lined up, but first we have a couple questions that we wanted to kind of get your takes on, really understand the makeup of this room that we have. So we've got, let's see. We had it working. There we go. Okay, if you can take out your phones and type in that address there or scan the QR code, this will take you to a survey. If you don't know what a QR code is or you can't see that address, you may want to leave because you're probably not a YP. I'll give everybody a minute to get it up there. Good question. Matt? Okay, yeah, once you get logged in, there's a thumbs up button, and just hit that button once you're logged in. We'll give everybody a chance to get connected on that Wi-Fi too. And if for whatever reason, if you get knocked out of the program, up at the top of every slide, you'll have the website and the user code to put in again if you need it. Okay, so first question, what's the makeup of the room? So it looks like mostly non-young professionals, so I'm gonna need you guys to leave. I'm kidding. That's, yeah, the cutoff was 35, but it's we also have the stipulation of five years or less in the industry, so certainly still included if that's the case. Perfect. So trending a little bit more experienced in the young professional category. So second, years in ED. Okay, good, pretty good distribution there. All right, we'll move on to the third one. Perfect. That's what we like to see. A lot of representation from all across the Southeast. So, perfect. As usual, a pretty good cluster from the host state and the region close by. Perfect. And then job titles that you've had in economic development, which, again, if you haven't seen one of these before, the larger the text, the more people have put in that keyword there. So a lot of directors, a couple of coordinators and research analysts, a good mix of folks. This is good. Perfect. Well, that'll help all of us kind of gauge our discussion here and move our discussion in the right direction based on the makeup of the room. So I'll ask our panelists to go ahead and take the stage, and we'll get started. What's that? Perfect. Well, this is the 2 o'clock session is just a kind of a consultant roundtable. We'll probably end up asking a couple questions, and then from there we'll divide up. Looks like we've got about 35 people in the room, so we'll probably divide up into different areas of the room to give you guys some opportunities to really interact in more of a one-on-one situation there with the consultants. But I'll turn it over to the consultants to introduce themselves and give a little bit of background specifically on how they got into economic development, maybe where they started and positions they've held throughout the industry. You've got mics next to you. Tess, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Tess Fay. I'm a principal with Global Location Strategies. We're a site selection firm based in Greenville, South Carolina, and I have been with the company for coming up on 5 years now, which has gone very fast. But I started my professional career right out of school doing marketing and PR and business development for a manufacturing company in Kentucky. Did that for about 5 years. And then when I was starting to look for a new opportunity, I stumbled into a job at the state of Kentucky, the Kentucky Cabinet for Economic Development, and that was my introduction to this world. So like I'm sure many of you, I just happened to fall into it. But I really loved all of the opportunities that it has given me, and look forward to talking more with all of y'all today.
Good afternoon, John Longshore, a Senior Managing Director with Newmark. I've been doing site selection coming up on 12-ish, something around there. I think it's right along with my wedding anniversary, which would be coming up on 12, so yeah.
As long as you're remembering that.
No, so I haven't hit 12 yet, now that I'm thinking about it. I have a background in civil engineering and was getting my master's in city planning, and I didn't want to do any planning at all, and happened to stumble across site selection because of McCallum Sweeney. Ed McCallum had gone through the program decades before I had, and as I looked into it, I thought this is probably a good mixture of all the things that I am good at and also that are of interest to me, and so kind of stumbled my way into this industry. Didn't know it existed. It was GLS, so I got my internship where Tess is now, and I just badgered Dee Dee Caldwell for months on end until she finally responded to me, and that's how I got into the industry, and I've loved it for the past 11 and a half years.
Let's see. Prior to economic development, I worked in supply chain, logistics, sales, marketing, business development background, then got into some risk management, strategic planning, working with the local Chamber of Commerce in my home area of Paducah, Kentucky, before a gentleman named Chad Chancellor came along and became the CEO there and was looking for a few good employees. So he brought me on as a project manager, and that is now, it'll be 14 years ago in 2 weeks. So, I was in economic development as a project manager, then helped start up a regional economic development organization, and was president and CEO of it for 9 years. and then got into site selection and consulting about 19 months ago now. It's almost 2 years already. It's kind of crazy how fast it goes. I've been blessed. I consider a lot of people in the site selection realm mentors of mine. They've taught me a lot. There's one sitting in the back of the room who's a mentor of mine back there. He's forgotten more than I may will ever know on site selection. But I've been blessed this last 19 months to work on a wide array of siting projects. I'd worked on a lot of projects as an economic developer, just like Tess had at the state. There's a whole different level that you thought you understood that you did not understand once you jump. Would you say that's true once you jump on this side of it? And I've learned a tremendous amount. So happy to share that because I was a YP as a part of this group not too long ago. So,
Perfect. We'll open it up to any questions from the audience first, if anybody, yeah, perfect. In the back.
Going off of what you just said, that disagrees that there's so many things that you talk to. So can you just say more on that? What kind of ways?
So some folks that went to dinner with me last night got to hear a little bit of this. I'm not going to say everything I said at dinner, but
He needs another bourbon.
I've got a bourbon actually for the next session because I've got to do the next session too. And I'm going to try not to talk too much because you're going to have to listen to me and Ivy next as well on career advancement. But one of the biggest aspects that has kind of been beaten into my brain is that when I was on the local side, there were certain things that I thought were really key and important. There were things that I thought were maybe on that list at 4 or 5, and that list was wrong. I had the list wrong. So when it comes to preparing your community and making sure that you have good sites, you are clearing, grubbing, grading. If you have private individuals and private ownership as a part of the sites that you are promoting, you had better make sure that you have those locked down. I don't care who you are. I don't care how good of a relationship you think you have with Farmer Joe or businessman Eric or whoever. You don't. You have to have those locked down. You're going to lose projects all day long if you're not doing the appropriate things. And I said this to somebody last night as well. I said I used to go to conferences and I'd hear site consultants and it seemed like I heard the same thing every single time I went over and over and over. There's a reason. It's because it's not getting through. That's why we have to keep saying it. But those types of things, and then I would say, I'll let Tess talk because I've talked too much.
I think that the transition for me from economic development into site selection was relatively smooth and easy because it's definitely the same world, you're talking the same language, but the depth of data and criteria you're evaluating is just so much broader, it's so much more detailed. And there were a lot of, I think, shocking insights when I came to GLS and saw the other side of the table, but one of them was, frankly, seeing how other states did economic development. I sort of was shocked that I ever won any projects in Kentucky just because I love Kentucky. It's a great place to do business, but I see how there are just other states who had more tools at their, that were at the ready. So it's been very interesting for me to see how differently economic development is done state to state, and then how you have sort of pockets of communities who just really do an excellent job at this. And those are the communities that, we don't typically have the luxury to tell our clients from the get-go exactly what their search region is, but there are definitely states and communities where if they're within that search region that makes sense, I love if I have the opportunity to work with them because they're the economic developers who fill out the RFI and who are, wanting to be a partner in this project with us. And that was another, I think, realization for me that not everyone fills out the RFI. I was like the good student who filled out every, answer. So I think, I don't know how, I think events like this, I would really make the most of to get to know project managers from other states and communities to understand how everyone else is doing economic development, because you may be the best within your region or within your state, but we are looking at many states. And so I think it's important to know what you're competing against in terms of just the level of partnership and professionalism and how you can continue to grow and excel in what you're doing in your community.
Perfect. Great question. Thanks for opening up the floor. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to take a step back, I guess, and ask you all what you think site selection means to you and what your day-to-day business is like. I know you're going to say it's different every day, but just want to understand how does it, and Tess, you were kind of talking on it, how it differs from traditional economic development. What is site selection and how does it work?
I got it. So the first question, what does site selection mean to me? Do you mean as a definition or like a more emotional, like?
Wherever you want.
Okay, or just kind of broad. Right, I like it. Well, I mean, when I was looking for kind of that pathway while I was in grad school, it definitely was a, kind of millennial, how can I make a difference, leave an impact type of thinking in terms of what I wanted to do, and this field allowed me to really impact not just maybe one community, but multiple along the way. And so that was something that I saw that would be an opportunity by getting into this field. I thought that it was going to be the feel-good, the impact was going to be the feel-good moments of, hey, the project landed here and the jobs and the investment and celebrate. That is more rare. What is more common is the elimination process and the feedback that you give along the way. And that is still leaving an impact to some degree, and you're hoping that it does have some influence. So you take the big wins when they come, but it's much more the smaller moments throughout a project's life cycle with the state economic developers, the local economic developers, and hoping to provide some good feedback along the way that can be taken to heart and acted upon to hopefully change something within that community or within that particular site that will ultimately lead to future investment along the way. I'll answer the first half and let you go second half.
I mean, I agree. I mean, John said a lot of great things about what it means to us and from a personal impact standpoint. I still see site selection from a passion standpoint, just like I did with passion as an economic developer on the local level. So I grew up very poor. Was in an old rusty out trailer until I was about 10 years old, and we were on food stamps until a company came to town and my dad got a decent job. So that fueled my passion for economic development my entire career. Now, it's a little different being on this side of it because now I don't want to say I'm picking and choosing losers, because in reality, what we're doing is we are creating an opportunity for our clients to see what the best opportunity for them is going to be in the marketplace. And truly, we're not picking the winners or losers. The winners are floating to the top based on the criteria that's most important to our clients. And you all don't realize the amount of things that could go wrong. You never know what could impact a decision. And I always used to hear these crazy stories of what could impact a decision coming to these conferences. And I had one recently where we cut a local community and they had a great site and a pretty good team. I'm not going to say they were the best local team, but they were doing good. And I want to help them get better. But the CEO of the company, early in that CEO's career, just so happened to spend 6 months in that community and had a terrible experience living there, working there. 10 years ago. The community's completely changed, but that bad taste is still there. Those weird, random things can occur. Now, does that mean that community lost because of that? No. But what I'm saying is, as an economic developer, you got to have your game face on when you're competing. And you've got to button up every aspect of how you compete and where you're going to compete and why you're going to compete, and make sure that you don't leave anything to chance. Because then it's those things that kind of sprinkle on top of the other negatives and really push you down. Would you say that's fair? Okay.
Yeah, and so my favorite, I mean, I love obviously seeing the impact, helping communities, like going back after the fact to see a project being constructed. But like John said, that's not that frequently that we get to see that. I mean, you all get to be much more hands-on from that perspective. But what I really love about this world of economic development and site selection is that it's like a big puzzle, and you have no idea what the pieces are, and you don't know what it's going to look like when you put it together. But you know the general direction that you're moving. And so it's like a fun, like I said, like a puzzle to try to figure out what are all of these pieces and how do they fit and what is the narrative that's going to come up along the way. And one of my pieces of advice to people who are just getting into this career is to make sure that you have inventoried your resources from like a stakeholder perspective, because you are never going to be able to be an expert in everything that you have to know at least a little bit about. You need to continue to learn so that you can be more knowledgeable in rail and electric and gas and water and school systems and all of that. But you have so many of those resources there at your disposal, and I think a big part of this job is to inventory what those resources are and make sure that you have them ready to deploy as part of that bigger puzzle as each project comes to you. So I would definitely be thinking about that if you aren't already.
Perfect. And to the younger folks in the room, I think it's worth understanding or remembering that this is a difficult profession, right? It's if you think about baseball, you get 3 hits out of 10, you're going to the All-Star game, right? In economic development, especially at the local level, if you win 1 out of 60, 70 projects, that's really good. So inherently, you're going to lose a lot of projects, and you just got to keep going and going after the next one. I remember at the local level, one of my first few projects I spent probably 2 years on and ended up coming in second. And there's probably no worse feeling than being the runner-up site, right? And you hear that a lot. It's like, well, you guys did a good job. You're the runner-up. But in the end, you have to start over from square one, right? And you're going back to the beginning to try and win that next project. But it's in the end, you learn something from that, right? So you're more prepared for that next project going on, moving forward. So that's something to keep in mind. Is you're inherently going to lose a lot of projects, but you just got to keep going and keep learning.
I have a question for you as a follow-up.
Sure.
Tables are turning.
Yeah.
So how do you, when you're in that role, and many of the group here in the room, I feel like one of the hardest parts is from the political aspect and again the stakeholder aspect, getting them all to understand that you're only going to win 1 out of 60 or whatever. And so what advice do you have for helping to manage those stakeholders and helping them see the long term and what economic development really is, that you're not going to get a win every other week?
Sure. So that's so background for me, started at the local level in Opelika, Alabama for about 3 years, moved to Winston-Salem, North Carolina for a couple years as well, and now I'm at TVA in Nashville, covering parts of 7 states. But at the local level, that was one of the keys in Opelika. They did a good job before I was there, but really stressed the importance to me of educating elected officials every year or every election cycle, right? Making sure they understand what you're doing day in and day out, and have a good understanding of the profession. Really get to know the site selection consultants. We frequently brought them to events like this, other site selection events, to meet those consultants and really understand and ask those questions of, how do we get better? How do we improve our sites? How do we improve our community? How do we market our community? So that they really had a good understanding of what that looks like day in and day out for us. That's key. Because at the end of the day, those are the people you're reporting to, right? Those are the people that hold your future in their hands. So making sure they understand what you're doing is paramount. Any other questions from the audience? Go ahead.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. My question is in regards to projects that are going after federal funding. So we're seeing a lot right now, both IRA, CHIPS, projects that we're seeing at the local and state level, your clients that are going after specific federal funds. Are you seeing, and clearly we don't work for the federal government, so our hands are tied on that aspect of assistance, but are you seeing any kind of best practices of local or state economic
If they're asking for you to help them find funding to get their startup off the ground, you need to be really careful. If they're a legitimate company, they should have a team that is doing that themselves, that is researched internally, and can get it done. You've got to be very careful. One of the things that I don't think we talk about enough is that as an economic development professional, it is both your job to promote and to try to bring new opportunities into your community, but is also to protect your communities from bad opportunities as well. And in a day and age where there are legitimate companies who need to utilize those programs and grants, there are always going to be, inevitably, companies who are trying to pull a fast one. I'll just say it like it is. And I've seen so many communities who have been told, hey, if you can just get us a $500,000 grant from your town, we're going to create X number of jobs. So I'm not saying that, and I'm not saying that these companies aren't legitimate. What I'm saying is you as an economic development professional, I would do as much potential due diligence as possible on these companies. And if you have a power company partner, an attorney, someone that can assist you in doing that due diligence on the backgrounds of the individuals in the company, then you need to go through that piece of it. And if Chuck Whipple were here, he would tell you to ask for their term sheet.
Yeah. Answer. Just a little bit more on that. So, we get requests, and I work for a state government, letters of support for data and information to help supply the grant for kind of the community itself, and advocating for your community or your state. To me, that seems rather normal, but would love any kind of other guidance of things that we can do to help.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I feel like that's all fairly reasonable. And I think with programs like the IRA, there really has not been much guidance for so long. And so I think we all are trying to figure it all out together, including the companies to an extent. But my understanding is with those applications, they have to have a site attached. And so I kind of am thinking about a couple of different aspects there. One, in terms of what can a community or a state do to help them, having a site that's ready to go and meets the needs, and having done the years of prep work really, I think, is the biggest thing that you can do to help, so that they can get that application in and make themselves look as attractive as possible. And that's very similar to defense contracts. I mean, I don't feel like that process is necessarily new. It's just that there are now, with IRA and CHIPS, different industries and different players, some of whom we know less well, that are asking for similar, support in terms of, helping them look most attractive and position themselves to rise to the top of that applicant pool. The other thing, though, I'm thinking about, and I feel like I'm very protective of communities because of my economic development background. And so I do worry about how many sites are currently tied up with companies that are not going to get that funding. And then what are they going to do? And I think about that. I think maybe with IRA, there's less, because those decisions are going to come quicker. But when I'm thinking like the mega site trend, we are not going to need mega sites for that much longer, surely. Like, how many more industries need 1,000+ acre sites? I don't know. But I do think about some of these mega sites that have gotten taken down by companies who we may or may not know very well, and how many years from now is that project not actually going to happen, and now you have a 1,000+ acre site in your community in a market that maybe doesn't need 1,000 acre sites. So I think that's relevant on the IRA side as well.
I was just going to speak, Shelby, anecdotally with many of Newmark's clients that are connected to, everything related to federal grants and CHIPS and IRA, that they typically have that running separately. Like they most of the time aren't even really involving us, even though we have the capabilities to do that. They'll let us do state and local incentives and coordinate, but when it comes to the federal, they really are key. They have other people who are doing that. Some companies, it's more, you're like, how dependent are you on it? And we don't even have as much insight into their decision making as it relates to moving forward on this project, and how dependent is it on the IRA funding? Like, what are they banking on? Versus like we have to just take their word this project's going to move forward, maybe no matter what. But I think just anecdotally, like that's even a little bit more kind of hidden from us on the site selection side, at least for us.
Well, and maybe that speaks to a little bit of like the vetting process that Chuck was sort of suggesting you go to. Like, not that you should only, I mean, you could choose to only work projects that come from site selectors, but realistically, that's not the world we live in. So, but maybe that's one of the criteria, right? Like, if they're working with one of us, that means that they are paying us, you know, that we are, at least they're paying someone to do some of the work. So maybe they've got their act together a little bit more, because I agree with John. We have clients who are going through that process, but it's totally separate from us, and usually with a more professional team who know what they're doing when it comes to the federal grant process.
Go ahead. Yep. You kind of.
Tess, I just have a question for clarification when you talk about the need for a mega site. So a lot of what we are seeing now because of the supply chain issues that were brought about by COVID are companies who are choosing a location not just for them, but for some of their suppliers. So while one single end user may not need that mega site, we could make an industrial park. Or are you saying it's just useless to prepare a 30-acre site?
I wouldn't say it's certainly not useless. I mean, anything in the site inventory and development world is certainly not useless. I think my recommendation when I'm talking to individual communities is to be really honest with yourself about what sort of project you could win, and making sure that you don't have a mismatch there. I think there's the political pressure because the mega projects get all the flashy headlines, and so then maybe you have local stakeholders who, you know, get everyone all revved up that you need a mega site, and really you don't. So I think every state absolutely needs to have a very robust inventory of product that includes a couple of mega sites. So that's part one. So definitely not useless. Is just think about, is your community really the one that's well positioned to be able to attract those projects? And then from a campus approach, I still think that those are out there. And I think the projects that need 1,000+ acres are still out there, but we've had this huge wave of those projects. And if you kind of look at the industries that, you know, it's like battery or metals, and like a question that I just asked to myself is, how many more industries need to go through that process that haven't yet? And so I'm wondering, again, just kind of thinking about, are we going to be seeing more? They may still be mega projects that just don't need mega sites, right? Not all big projects need 1,000+ acres. But I'm wondering if we're going to see more of a transition to the suppliers, like you mentioned, who are going to supply the companies on the mega site.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have sort of like a rural development workforce question. So all of our states have large rural BIPOC populations where the aggregate of the data can be stigmatizing. But at the same time, like if we were to remove education as a proxy for skills, they really would be standout sites and more competitive across the country. Are you seeing ways that we can sort of quantify that for site selectors and companies to understand?
Hold on, I'm going to practice my marriage counseling. So what I heard you say, is that you have sites and they're getting eliminated based off of the workforce data. And you asked something about education and skills. So is it like maybe it's not meeting a education threshold, like number of people?
They're a highly skilled population within rural America, but at the same time, because of inequitable strategies within states, they haven't had the same sort of investment in college education or access to post-secondary opportunities. So when site selectors are looking at the data, we might be 84% high school graduate, 24% college graduate, but you don't necessarily need a political science degree to go onto the front line of industry. So we tend to get very far along in site selection based on sites, based on land, utility availability, water resources. But what usually gets us kicked out is when they're looking at the aggregate of demographic data and they're sitting there comparing us to a a more urban or suburban community where our education or workforce data shows us as lacking?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like that you are at least making it through an initial cut, though, right? So you're at least making it past the desktop, which seems maybe relatively consistently, and it's more about getting down to like the short list, right? But so often with rural communities and sites, we don't even get looked at because we get cut at a desktop level, and that does happen, right? We're trying to narrow down the universe of possibilities. So, I'm kind of like, if they have you in there with urban, like, I don't know, that seems kind of two contradictory type of options. Yeah, I'm trying to think, like, if you're at a short list and you're the final 3 to 5. I don't know. It seems like you're kind of right there at the finish line. It's just not quite.
What type of projects are they?
Yeah, are we talking manufacturing?
We're competing against is like urban peripheral. So like if we're in the Mississippi Delta, they're much more likely to still go rural, but they're going to be on the peripheral of Memphis.
I see.
Yeah, and they're not necessarily going to be in a place like a Clarksdale or a Greenville or Indianola. So it kind of creates this competition between the two, even though they might have skills, one might not be as post-secondary educated as the other.
How do you know?
But how can we quantify those skills?
Yeah, sorry. How do you know that that's the reason? Are you getting that feedback?
We get feedback.
And you're getting the feedback that it's specific to educational attainment?
We're getting it that it's specific to workforce.
Okay. So you're making the assumption it has to do with educational attainment versus skills. Here's what I will say, and I think this is a good practice for everyone in the room. The data that you have and the data that we have can sometimes be the same. As the Lido or Redo or whatever your position is, maybe you're the WIB. The data that we pull is black and white. The Lido, the Redo, the WIB, Workforce Investment Board. So, all right. So, which are critical. Yeah, we're gonna play acronym soup later.
I don't think you're a WIB. You don't seem like a WIB.
The data's black and white that we have. The data that you may have is black and white. As a community or a region, you have to fill in the color. You have to paint a picture. And so when I'm doing a site selection project, I'm asking questions, sitting in the room with the community, I already know the answer that I have. I'm not asking the question to necessarily affirm the answer that I have. Maybe I am. I want you to maybe tell me something different. What study have you done recently? Have you worked with a consultant? I don't know if you all do this. Our firm works with communities on how they can paint a better picture of their labor market, what that looks like, what your advantages are. And look, the thing is, maybe you're competing on projects that your labor market isn't a match for. It's just like what Tess said earlier about sites. Your product and your labor have to be a match for what you're trying to win. And so that could be an issue too. And I'd be happy to dive in deeper with this, but I wanted to give you those surface level things, but it could be a couple of things that could help you all get better at staying in on those projects, because I will tell you, if you've got a strong population base that matches what the criteria for the project is, educational attainment's not the key. It's really, I don't even look at it. I truly look at skill sets. I look at location quotients on specific SOC codes, occupation codes, and then I'll work through what your training opportunities are to upskill people for those jobs. I'll even look at what jobs you have open in those SOC codes when I'm looking at you. So there's a lot of things we look at. You all can provide the color, and there's a way that you all can get there. But if somebody has to come in and really understand why you're losing, that's where I'm getting at.
And I think, so I agree with everything Chuck just said, and I would also think about, as a community, who your ideal customer is. So if you think about, having a store, you're going to have one customer who you would love to have, one of those walk in every day. Then you're going to open the door and let everyone else come in too, but you're really going to, pull out all the stops for your ideal customer. And so I think that is exactly the same as the work of economic development. So you have to know as a community who your ideal customer is that makes sense from a data perspective, who is actually attainable, who really matches the skill sets that I'm trying to get out there. And then you need to market for that ideal customer. So that means figuring out, doing your homework to know who are the site selectors who work those projects and getting out there ahead of them to say, hey, you may not have thought about my region before because we have a smaller population, but here, let me tell you all the reasons why I think that this could be a really good opportunity for your clients. Because then in the back of our heads, we can make a special case for a project, and we do this all the time, where we're like, well, the data says that we shouldn't look in this region. However, I know from experience that they have this really cool program, or this facility closed and left all these skill sets here, or whatever it is, and we can try to get you in the game, whereas otherwise you may not.
Yeah, I think the hardship, I think, for most of us in rural is, I hear your alignment point. I think we're trying to reach for that quality employer instead of the ones who are typically sizing themselves for rural markets. And that's probably what's kind of creating our difficulty right now in that conversation.
There's a strategy you can get to, though. You can still get quality in rural, guaranteed, because we did it in a place that people thought that you would never do it, and that was Appalachia. Quality employers there. So,
Yep, go ahead.
I wanted to circle back to your comments earlier. How do you all, as site consultants, vet your clients? That's one question. And question two is, well, answer that first one, if I get the second one.
I mean, there's kind of an initial, as they're looking for a consultant, they are recognizing, hey, we need to pay someone to help us, and that's almost an initial vetting in of itself when they've reached out to us and like, okay, like they're looking, they know they're going to have to pay us. I will say that of kind of current vetting process is regarding any sort of Chinese-based companies. Chinese leadership, Chinese on the board of directors, but we're having to be very thoughtful and having a lot more due diligence, asking people to do some digging, because we can only dig so much in terms of who's funding who, but we're having to ask that question and evaluate that a lot more in terms of asking, is this company that we might want to work with? And same thing within the EV space, even if they're trying to come, and hire a consultant, we have to try to validate how real this project is. If they say they have a $100 million project and they're willing to pay us and they have funding to do that, then, we're happy to continue be a part of their kind of startup iteration or whatever it might be to help them potentially identify sites. And we try to communicate as best we can on the front end, if it's an established company, if it's a startup. So, we're trying to give as much information to the economic developers that we can. But, I don't know if we haven't run into too many clients where I'm like, oh, well, this wasn't a good fit. It's probably rare, few and far between. So, be interested to hear you too.
Yeah, I mean, similar to John, I would say on companies that aren't established, that would sort of be the same gig. If they're an established company, I still like to understand, what does their growth look like? What do they look like historically? Who are their board of directors, if they have a board of directors, their ownership? I still like to understand those things about the company to make sure that this is still a legitimate thing as well. Because that's the thing, it's very similar to what, in my career on the economic development side, I did a massive amount of recruiting and one-on-one, face-to-face with CEOs. I've met with 800 to 900 CEOs of firms across North America and Europe over the last 8 years. And I was vetting them in a similar fashion to what we do from a site selection side now. It's understanding their business plan. Do they have a solid business plan? Do they have a good track record? What's their growth look like recently? Because not every company, are they about to try to do a project based on hopes and dreams, or do they have contracts? So, and do they have the funding to do it? All those different things. But it's a lot easier if they're an established company. If they're not, it's harder.
I remember my second question was, in Florida, typically we get connected to site consultants via the confidential lead process that
you have all the details, you just don't have a company name. So what percentage of projects do you see come in to GLSI or the Next Move Group or Newmark that never get to the finish line? Are you 100% yes, we get them all, we find a place for them? Or is it 50%? What kind of ratio is that?
I would say first, before I answer that, I think that you should always ask for feedback. So not everyone will give it to you. We try to the best we can. It's hard sometimes to remember because the project's moving so fast, but I would definitely encourage you to always go back to wherever you got the RFI from. So if it's from the state or from Duke or FPL, and ask for them to ask for feedback.
We get no feedback whatsoever at the county level.
Well,
We get no feedback.
yeah, so what I'm saying is you should, if you're not asking whoever sent you the RFI for them to get feedback to bring back to you, you should definitely do that because I feel like we all want to give that feedback. Even if a whole state is cut early in our process, I still want to give the state feedback as to why. And so I feel like this is a partnership. We can't do what we do without you all. And so I think it's completely fair and reasonable and the responsibility of economic developers to make that ask. I know you're in a harder spot because you're not getting it directly, but whoever is giving that RFI to you should be getting that feedback to then turn around and give to you. To answer your actual question, I don't know, 50%? It really varies. I mean, and they go away for different reasons, like market conditions are a lot of it, typically.
I just want to hit on the feedback piece, just in terms of process and a little bit of insight, right? As we send that RFI out, let's say, I'm just making up numbers, like it goes to 6 states and 6 states submit 10 sites each. That first screening that we might make, our feedback to the states, generally speaking, is which one is in. It's more like, okay, these are still in, and not that we're not trying to give feedback on what was eliminated. It's just that's just the timing. Like we're working with a larger amount of data and sites, and so it's okay. Here's maybe a medium-sized list. Let's call it 8 to 10. And that's when we begin maybe dealing directly a little bit more with the local community, and we'll have the relationship and we'll give the direct feedback. But it's not that we don't want to give the feedback at the RFI process. It's just that's not the priority in the method of communication. In terms of projects being announced, I'll say it seems since I don't know the past 3 or 4 years, it seems more of them are announcing. When I first started, I mean, it took a few years. I worked so many projects. They're on the bigger side, so it's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of capital investment, and those have a lengthy approval process, and they just weren't quite moving forward. But here recently, the percentage has been a lot higher.
Other questions from the audience? Anything? Go ahead.
Everybody really wants those mega projects, it seems. Still certain communities targeting that with their larger sites, that being a priority rather than something that, right, it's a lot of capital investment and a lot of jobs. That's back on the forefront for some. But on the flip side of that is the locations with your 3% unemployment. And we would rather have a data center because that's a lot of capital investment, goes to our school, the property tax go to our school, but we're not stressing, the roads, we're not adding a lot of stress to the school systems, et cetera. So you're seeing the kind of that mega project kind of theme just from different angles, right? And what communities may want. From that perspective. So I think that to me is kind of interesting. What people were like, we want more, we don't want more. Give us less.
Specifically on incentives, I've actually started seeing a few states who are, because they've had so many mega projects, they're about incentived out. Certain programs, Tennessee's really tightened up on the process for their incentives. which I think for those of you who may be border Tennessee and feel like that, you have trouble competing against them, they're putting us through the ringer just to get an estimate on incentives now in Tennessee. Right, wrong, or indifferent, that's their process now. I understand it, I get it, but it is what it is. And that part of that is to protect their taxpayers from the fly-by-night types of projects we talked about earlier. On the big mega projects, cash, there's still always going to be cash on the table for those. What I think this is what John was saying, was don't feel like you always have to chase those. Understand what your bread and butter is. There's a lot of things we've said today. Understand what your community can handle, what you're willing to go after, and what you're willing to do from an incentive standpoint on the front end. I still think tried and true wrapping incentives around real estate in some fashion to help reduce startup costs and long-term operating costs. Your state should be helping you with the long-term operating costs with their incentive package, and it's up to you as a community, especially on your run-of-the-mill projects, to work on how you reduce startup costs for that company.
Yeah, I've been saying now for a year or two that from my perspective in industrial site selection, the number one incentive that a community can offer is having a property that is ready to go. Because sites are so hard to find right now. And again, it's like Chuck said, it's like you come to this and hear the same thing over and over again. But I don't know that it's getting any better right now. It feels like it's getting tighter. Certainly there are states, a lot of whom are represented by SEDC, who are investing in really big ways to rectify that problem. But site development takes years. So everyone's, trying to play catch up. But I really feel like for many of our clients, just having a site that we can evaluate is a pretty big deal. So obviously once it gets down to the last few finalists, that's when incentives become more important in terms of offsetting the differences between locations. But just being able to have a property at all is a pretty big win, I think, for your community.
Go ahead, yeah.
Just one follow-up. So with some of the bigger mega project incentive deals that have had trouble getting across the finish line, do you guys vet incentive offers differently than you maybe did 5 years ago or 2 years ago, with kind of state and localities putting together offers and their ability to actually kind of bring those to fruition?
Are you talking like the Rivian deal? Is that kind of the baseline? I haven't really run into that issue. I mean, we go through the normal, like what, in terms of what's the requirements for the client to meet, the thresholds, the milestones, the processes, but I can't.
That's almost a crystal ball question.
Yeah.
Because if the state commits to something, how are we supposed to really truly vet whether or not they're going to come through on it? If they say they're going to do it, and they sign the paperwork, and the MOUs are in place. Now, it is on us to make sure that the appropriate contracts and language is in place, and the attorneys that are on the project as well, because we're not attorneys, but there's attorneys available, and so we make sure that all of that is, all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, but at the end of the day, we can't predict what's going to happen in the future. So, it's not like we can do a whole lot different than what we do now.
I do feel like I've noticed, though, that our clients are becoming more aware of public perception of them and more sensitive to trying to get ahead of kind of the PR angles, because there definitely has been more like vocal pushback, at least on industrial projects, I feel like more recently. And so I do feel like they are having an awareness of like, oh, we should bring in a PR firm before we announce and start to kind of lay the groundwork to get ahead of that. And then we do the best that we can to manage risk, or at least assess risk of things like public pushback and, political, momentum, and continuing to build that. But I agree. I mean, beyond getting the documents in place, I think it's kind of hard for us to, maybe we should be doing more. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Open to ideas.
I would say, we cover parts of 7 states. The only thing we've run into is like what they used to call phantom incentives, right? Is a company going to build up enough tax liability to take advantage of X incentive, or is the pilot, the payment in lieu of taxes has to be, you have to bring in a bond lawyer. So is it really going to be worth it to bring in a bond lawyer for an extra $50,000 at the end of it, or an extra $10,000 once you subtract the cost of the bond lawyer, whatever it is? Is it worth all the work for that? Those are kind of the only things that we've seen. Haven't really thought about it the other way, though. It seems like most of the companies are just relying on the state to hold up their end of the bargain, because they do have a deal in place. So, other questions? This has been the easiest moderating I've ever done. I like it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, can you talk about some maybe unique local incentives you've seen local EOs offer, or some best practices as you've done site visits with local communities that maybe we can take home with us?
My one example I've been thinking about from a local incentive perspective, this does not work for very many projects, but this did happen to be a mega project, and there were a lot of moving pieces to get the project, to announce, and then from announcement through construction and starting operation, there is going to be a lot. And so the local community there, as part of their incentive package, offered to hire someone full-time who will sit on their staff, who becomes the day-to-day liaison. So we go away, and basically this local community was offering to bring someone on who would take our place in terms of making sure everything continued to run smoothly. I thought that was really interesting. Obviously, it only works for a very large sort of project to be able to fund that, but I thought that was pretty interesting.
How long are they staying in place?
I think at least a couple of years. I mean, it wasn't like a quick thing by any means. So.
I mean, some things aren't in your control because of state legislation. Because local communities can only do certain things. So, communities who have put a focus on creating deal closing funds, where they have access to capital when they need it to close deals, and not that you should be giving away cash necessarily, but you should be able to move with what the company's needs are. Again, going back to reducing startup costs. And so, the best incentives lately that I've seen are having sites that are fully prepared, that have been invested in with build-ready pads on them, because that last deal that we announced over in Bristol, Tennessee, it's the reason Bristol won, is because they had put $2 million into that site, and it was exactly what the company needed and ready to go. So if you can do that from a real estate perspective, that also goes back to, and I don't know how you all score them, but if you have privately owned property, it's going to score lower than property that's owned by an industrial authority or a local community. So,
I'm talking a little bit about this tomorrow during the case study presentation, but specifically to Cleveland, Tennessee, where our client went, SK Food Group, they make kind of pre-made sandwiches for your favorite green and white coffee place. And there was a small wetland that was kind of impacting the site. It had already been delineated. All the standard work had been done, which is, what you expect. But they were on a short list, and before we even had asked about it, we were like, this is in a good spot. It's in a good spot. The local economic developer went and identified the credits that he was going to have to acquire, and got the funding approved locally with his council to have that ready to go. So once the site was transacted, he'd be able to go and acquire the credits. Which being that proactive before even some indication that they were the preferred location was incredible. Was a huge incentive that offset that particular site risk. On the workforce side, they have, I don't even know how to fully describe it to you in a short amount of time, but their newly developed kind of workforce, like K through post education training facility. We'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow, but they gave them space for office space, for setting up, a smaller line as they began operations, which it just was very, very unique. And honestly, it was one of the things that helped seal the deal was that they had a community behind them that was going to help make sure that they start up effectively, and got their folks trained in a very collaborative working space. So it was just there were very unique incentives that were put on the table to help offset risk and get these guys up and running.
I had two other thoughts that these guys prompted. So first, I think Chuck said, your hands are tied to some extent when it comes to incentives. But then John also started talking about kind of thinking ahead, looking ahead to what could be the issue. And when you all get an RFI or a project description, even if it's a really minimal amount of information, there's actually a lot about a project that you can figure out pretty easily from just CapEx, job count, some basic utility numbers. And that's something I'm happy to share with anyone who wants to kind of walk through that exercise. But you can very easily, just with those few data points, get some good intel about the project and probably what they're going to be driven by. And so I think one of the things that can take a good economic developer to being more of a great economic developer is thinking proactively, thinking like the project, and knowing what the issue is before we recognize what the issue is. So no location is going to be perfect, and we are gonna find out what the flaws are sooner or later. And it's so it just feels better and more impressive and more like you know what you're talking about when you proactively say, hey, I know or I anticipate that there's going to be this, concern, and here's what I've already identified as the solution for you. And that may not be specifically a monetary incentive, but just identifying that path, finding the credits, like tracking down that pathway before we have to say, hey guys, why have you been hiding from me that there are these 2 acres of wetlands that are right in the middle of my footprint? It's just, again, that takes a good economic developer and turns them into a great one. But then the other thought I had too, I know at least I am usually very hesitant to have political leaders be part of the site selection process, at least early. And I would always recommend that before you bring like a mayor or a city councilman to a site visit, always check with the site selection consultant first to make sure that that's appropriate. However, I will say as we get further along down the process, I feel like it goes a really long way to have high-level leaders somehow engaged in the project just to show support. This was something else that transitioning from economic development into site selection was a little bit shocking because I felt like in Kentucky it was pretty easy to get access to the governor if you needed a phone call made or just like, hey, here you're thinking about Kentucky, we'd love to have you, let me know what I can do. I'm working a project right now that's like $800 million, 400 jobs in a part of a state that does not get projects like this. And we had to fill out an online form requesting for a governor to make a phone call, and then we had to wait a month, and then our request got denied. So it just remember, again, when we're thinking about know what all of your resources are, that's one of them, and know when to pull that trigger, because when you're getting down to the short list, that sort of connection and feeling like across all levels of the state really are want this project, that really means a lot to our clients.
Yeah. The similar size project working right now, and I gave a piece of advice yesterday to a power company, and he said, what could we have done to do a better job? And I said, you all should have had your governor at the table early, because there was a state that probably didn't, probably wasn't as prepared as you, but it impressed the client that they had the governor on the site visit for this project because it's such a large project. It would mean so much to that area, and they just never engaged theirs. So Tess is 100% right. I can't believe you had to fill out an online form. You have to tell me who that was.
It was not an SEDC state. I'll let you paint in the rest.
Other questions from the audience? I've got a couple still. I think we've got a little bit more time. Going back to Tess's point about elected officials, I know if you're at the local level, you've probably experienced this. They'll read about an announcement in the newspaper and come running in. and ask, were we included in this project? And if not, why not? So can you kind of talk on what happens from the time you sign a company to work with them to the time the RFI goes out, and kind of what all work happens in between those two phases?
We're really trying to figure out what the project is. Like you get this initial, many times here you get this kind of vague description of the project. You might even sign the NDA, but they might just give you a little bit of information and timing. But once we get the thumbs up, hey, you're the consultant, then we're really trying to get as much information as we can about the company and about the project. Still trying to meet their timelines, but for us, that initial phase, before there's any external outreach, there is a lot of time hopefully spent with the client. Some are better than others about wanting to actually work with us. It's like, hey, you've signed us up, like this would be helpful for you to like let us come visit an existing site if we can. Let's meet, let's have a couple of days together talking about the project. Sometimes companies are just like, here's the information, get going. And we don't have as great of a relationship. It just kind of varies. But that's a lot of the front end is getting that information. What are the key criteria that are the must that you need to have? What are the nice to haves, right? Trying to really flush those out before we actually go and engage with the states and the communities. Sometimes we do go out and then the criteria changes, and then we have to go back to you guys and say the criteria changed and you're no longer under consideration or something like that. But we do our best to vet on the front end, and that can take a few weeks to get that done.
For us, I mean, it's similar. We want to kind of walk through together a must and wants session with the client first thing. So that's where we're going to identify what John just said and go through geography and all these other issues and get that out of the way before we ever go out. And honestly, if there's a client that I sign up that doesn't want to go through that process appropriately, it makes our job more difficult. So it's kind of somebody I don't really want to work with if they're not going to do it the right way. So.
Well, and I know somewhere we're being recorded, right? So for the client who is watching this 6 years in the future, you're wonderful to work with, and I love having you as a client. But for everyone else, if you all think that it's a painful process when we come to you with our specs, it has been so much worse the last 4 or 6 weeks. I feel like more and more common. It's just a lot of our job is trying to corral different stakeholders from their teams who all have very different things that they want. And some of them have, oh, well, I want to be in this community for no reason that makes any sense. And then one of them's like, the only thing that matters is my trucking volumes. And that it's like having to sit down with all of these people who have done very well in their careers and advanced to the point to be part of this meeting, right? And then try to help them all get on the same page in terms of what are we doing and why is this important and how do we balance all of these perspectives while validating each individual along the way. So, a lot of times you'll come back and ask more specific questions, and we are doing our best to get that information, but it's just not always the easiest process. But during that, and in addition to the alignment that has been mentioned and helping the client to really understand what are the important factors that are going to help them be successful long term, we're also doing typically initial regional screening. So sometimes they come in and they know exactly the region that they need to be in, but at least for our clients, often it's a larger area of the country or the world that they could consider. And we know that it's not reasonable, nor is it really, I don't feel like it's in anyone's best interest to go out to 26 states with an RFI or something. So we're trying to proactively narrow it down to what states or regions are going to make most sense based upon some key drivers to the project so that we get to a more responsible number of areas that we're sending the RFI to. And so we've already done some preliminary data. If you're getting the RFI, you made the workforce cut, the initial workforce cut at least, you've made some additional initial logistics cuts. So there's a lot of that data crunching going on initially as well.
Perfect. I think we got time for one more question. We'll make it an audience question if we've got one. Yeah, go ahead in the back. Like Tess said she's seen it. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got some project-specific experience too. We can talk about later.
If there's any information out there that you can go and see something from the eyes of what we could have done better. I mean, obviously that's a movie. It's on Netflix if anyone wants to watch it. But basically, they brought in this Chinese company. It was a culture clash between American and Chinese cultures. And I was just wondering if there's any way to kind of go and look for lessons learned when something doesn't work out. If there's any particular deals in the last 5 years that didn't work out, you can go look. I think of Fox Communications in Wisconsin, where they invest all that money and that didn't turn out. But I think you know what I'm saying. I'm just curious if you have any theories. People can go look for that.
So American Factory is a really excellent documentary, and I'm glad you brought that up. I would absolutely encourage everyone here as part of your a homework assignment for everyone here should be to watch American Factory. It's really great. But it's about a Chinese company who invests in Ohio, and like you said, it's just all this culture clash. On its face, the initial announcement, right, big exciting project, lots of jobs, lots of capital investment, and then the execution just did not go well. I have seen the other side of that. So we announced a Chinese company just down the road from them last year, and I think that they definitely, as a state and as a regional group, worked to understand. First of all, I think that there's a little bit, it's a little bit over the top, that documentary. I think it's true, but maybe just highlights pieces of the story, right? So it's definitely not as terrible as it looks from the documentary in terms of the final relationship there. But the state and the region absolutely worked very hard to understand what they should be doing. And, they had never had a Chinese investment previously and had to figure out how to engage with a totally different culture. For our client, they had done all of their homework because of that experience with Fuyao, and it was a huge part of the reason why the client ultimately was drawn to Sydney, Ohio, which is north of Dayton, where Fuyao is, because they knew exactly what the programs were that they should implement and how to work with Chinese companies. And they just had done that kind of post-mortem, even though the company is still there. So it's not really a post-mortem, but to look back and see what could we have done better and how do we better prepare for this moving forward. And that experience is a big part of the reason why they won our project, which was, I think, 2,200 jobs and $1 billion. So another really big one. I don't know if y'all have other
examples. This is anecdotal. There are two states that are in SEDC, and they are kind of in the same region. So it's just anecdotal. Okay, I'm not painting a full picture. But in Memphis, and help me out here, Pigeon Park?
Yeah. Pigeon Industrial Park.
Pigeon Industrial Park. Was it Electrolux? Who was there? Was somebody?
Electrolux.
It was Electrolux,
yeah.
right? And they scaled up way too quickly. So Memphis, if you look at the unionization data, it's higher than in most southern states, generally speaking. And so that's a question from from clients, right? Okay, is it going to happen? What's the narrative? But Electrolux was a good example of they scaled up too quickly. There were some other kind of cultural things, and they unionized and they ended up shutting down the facility. That was some years ago, but that's part of the narrative. And south of there in Mississippi, kind of as you're down towards going towards the Delta. I can't remember the small town. Anyways, but there was a couple of manufacturers that we interviewed who they selected this particular area because of incentives. So that was really heavily driven by, we have a site, we were given a lot of incentives, and we made a decision that we shouldn't have made. So these are very anecdotal decisions and lessons learned. And I don't know if there's a data source where you can go find that. I think it's maybe some news articles, it's talking to your peers here in the industry of what worked or what didn't work or what would we have done different. I don't know if there's a these projects did not make the right decision, and here's why type of a database and being able to go to it.
No, that's good that you mentioned that. In fact, one of the reasons I was thinking of the documentary was because they had the governor come and speak and talk about the pros of using union labor. It was a non-union Chinese company, so that was another example of bringing in somebody who you didn't know what the pitch was going to be from that person. So it would have been better off saying, here are your talking points. Let's get your talking points before you come talk to the group. So interesting. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. I think we're going to move on to the next panel or the next session. But can we get a round of applause for the consultants today?
Thank you.